The crisp autumn air, usually a harbinger of cozy evenings, and the scent of wood smoke, felt charged with a different kind of energy that Saturday. My son, Daniel, was marrying Sarah in our backyard. Not some sprawling estate, mind you, just our comfortably large, meticulously kept suburban yard, the one I'd seeded and mowed and edged for 20 years. It was meant to be intimate, a gathering of 50 souls who genuinely loved them, under a string of tasteful fairy lights, and the ancient oak that had witnessed 3 generations of my family's milestones. Folding chairs, white, unassuming, were arranged in neat rows on the lawn I'd aerated just last spring. Karen Albright, HOA president by what I could only assume was a clerical error in the cosmic voting system, saw those chairs from her perch across the street, her silhouette a vulture against her perfectly bland beige curtains. She didn't see a wedding. She saw, in her words to the 911 dispatcher, an illegal gathering, a flagrant disregard for community bylaws, and, my personal favorite, an unpermitted public assembly likely constituting a noise and zoning violation. The first responding officers, Miller and Diaz, looked young, uncomfortable, and frankly, a little embarrassed as they stepped onto my driveway, their arrival heralded by the muted whoop of a siren deliberately cut short. Daniel's face, moments before alight with prenuptial joy, crumpled. Sarah's eyes welled. Karen, however, stood on her porch, arms crossed, radiating the smug satisfaction of a petty tyrant whose tiny, insignificant button had actually yielded a response. "There seems to be a complaint about an illegal ceremony?" Officer Miller began, his gaze flicking from the floral archway to me. I smiled, a thin, polite veneer over the cold fury rapidly crystallizing in my gut. This wasn't just about folding chairs anymore. This was about my son's wedding day. This was about my family. "Officer," I said, my voice calm, almost gentle, "there is no illegal ceremony." I reached into the breast pocket of my suit jacket, the one I'd chosen with such care for this day. I didn't pull out a wallet. I pulled out my badge. "I'm County Fire Marshal Frank Maxwell." Their eyes widened. Then, from the same pocket, a neatly folded document. "And this," I continued, unfolding it with deliberate precision, "is the special event permit, number 734 Alpha Charlie, authorizing this private gathering, complete with provisions for amplified sound until 10 p.m. and temporary structures, namely 52 folding chairs and 1 floral arch. Signed, you'll note, by Mayor Thompson himself last Tuesday." I handed it to Miller, whose Adam's apple bobbed. Diaz was already looking towards Karen's house with an expression that mingled disbelief with a dawning, terrible understanding. Karen, bless her oblivious, overreaching heart, hadn't moved. She probably thought my badge was a party favor. Furthermore, I added, my voice dropping to a tone I usually reserved for imminent structural collapses or 5-alarm blazes, given that a 911 call has been initiated from that residence. I gestured with my chin towards Karen's immaculate, soulless house, alleging public safety concerns, however unfounded regarding this property. I'm now professionally obligated to ensure there are no actual public safety hazards originating from the complainant's address that might, say, endanger this legally permitted assembly. "Officer Miller, Officer Diaz, perhaps you'd be good enough to accompany me." "Standard procedure, you understand." Miller swallowed again, nodded dumbly, and handed the permit back as if it were radioactive. Diaz just looked relieved to have a new, more legitimate focus. Karen's smugness began to curdle as I, flanked by 2 uniformed police officers, started walking towards her prize-winning petunias and, more importantly, her front door. "Oh, and Mrs. Albright," I called over my shoulder, the smile still in place, though it now felt more like a baring of teeth. "While I'm there, we'll just do a quick check on your propane tank placement. I thought I smelled something a little off earlier, and perhaps review your HOA's annual registration with the county. Just a formality, of course." Her face went from puce to a rather alarming shade of gray. The game, as they say, had just changed. And the folding chairs, ironically, were now the least of her concerns. She saw folding chairs and called the cops, said we were having an illegal ceremony. Cops arrived. So did my badge. My uniform wasn't on, but the authority was, and the permit hand signed by the mayor. Then I evacuated her house for code violations. Turns out, she had an illegal propane tank and forgot to file her HOA registration this year. The beautiful, terrible symmetry of it all was just beginning to unfold. The whole affair with Karen Albright hadn't started with the wedding, of course. It had been a slow burn, a gradual accretion of petty grievances and officious pronouncements that had, until now, been merely irritating, like a persistent mosquito in a dark room. Daniel and Sarah had decided on a backyard wedding for reasons that resonated deeply with me: intimacy, personal history, and a shared disdain for the exorbitant, impersonal wedding industry. Our yard, with its mature trees and carefully tended flower beds, was, in their eyes, perfect. In Karen Albright's eyes, it was merely another canvas upon which to project her anxieties and exert her minuscule dominion. When Daniel first proposed the idea, my wife, Martha, had been ecstatic. "Our boy getting married in the garden where he took his first steps," she'd exclaimed, already envisioning fairy lights and mason jar centerpieces. My primary concern, even then, was less about floral arrangements and more about preemptive compliance. I knew my neighborhood. I knew Karen. So, the first thing I did, long before a single chair was rented, was to walk the permit application through the county planning office myself. I'd chatted with Janice in zoning, shared a coffee with Henderson in Public Works, and finally got Mayor Thompson, an old fishing buddy, to personally review and sign off. Citing it as a fine example of community spirit, he chuckled, asked about my golf handicap, and stamped it with a flourish. I'd tucked that permit away, a trump card for a game I hoped I wouldn't have to play. Karen's early salvos were predictable. A passive-aggressive note about the temporary nature of the string lights we tested one evening. HOA Guidelines, Section 4, Subsection B, limit decorative lighting to seasonal displays, not to exceed 30 days. I'd politely replied, referencing the county-approved special event permit, which superseded her little fiefdom's pamphlet. She'd then questioned the structural integrity of the small rented marquee we planned for the food table, implying it might spontaneously take flight and impale her prize-winning poodle. I'd sent her the engineering specs and wind resistance rating, CC'ing my lawyer for good measure. Each interaction was a miniature skirmish, my calm, factual rebuttals apparently acting as accelerant on her simmering indignation. She couldn't stand being corrected, especially by someone who so clearly knew the actual rules, not just the ones she'd invented in her head. The folding chairs, however, became her Waterloo. We'd had them delivered 2 days early, stacked neatly on the patio. Karen must have seen them from her upstairs window, perhaps through binoculars, her mind racing, connecting dots that weren't there. To her, 50 white folding chairs weren't for a wedding. They were a provocation, a clear sign of impending suburban anarchy. She probably imagined us hosting an illegal poker tournament, or, worse, a multi-level marketing seminar. Her internal monologue, I suspect, would have been a masterpiece of paranoid delusion, each chair a soldier in an invading army set to destroy her meticulously curated neighborhood order. My son Daniel, bless his patient heart, had tried to reason with her once. "Mrs. Albright," he'd said, encountering her as she meticulously measured the distance of our mailbox from the curb with a tape measure, "it's just for my wedding. A very small, quiet affair." Karen had peered at him over the rims of her glasses, her expression one of profound skepticism. "Quiet, you say? With that many chairs, Mr. Maxwell?" "The bylaws are quite clear on unauthorized commercial activity." Commercial activity. He was marrying the love of his life. She was worried about phantom commerce. I had merely observed this exchange from my porch, sipping iced tea, my mind a repository of county codes, fire regulations, and a growing sense of anticipatory weariness. I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that she would escalate. It was her nature. Like a scorpion, she couldn't help but sting. The beauty of it was, I also knew the antidote, and it was filed neatly in triplicate. The escalation, when it came, was textbook Karen. The day before the wedding, as my brother-in-law, a professional landscaper, was helping us arrange some potted mums around the patio, Karen materialized at the edge of our property line, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield. "Mr. Maxwell," she began, her voice tight with suppressed outrage. "I've received several anonymous complaints regarding the excessive alteration of landscaping for what appears to be a commercial event." I glanced at the half-dozen pots of perfectly ordinary chrysanthemums. "Commercial event, Mrs. Albright? This is my son's wedding. And these are mums, potted mums. Hardly a Lawrence of Arabia set construction." Her eyes narrowed. "The sheer volume, Mr. Maxwell, and the noise associated with their delivery and placement. Disturbing the peace." Section 7, subsection C. I sighed. A sound I was perfecting. "The mums arrived in a Prius, Mrs. Albright. It made less noise than your leaf blower at 7 a.m. last Tuesday. And again, special event permit on file supersedes." "Would you like another copy?" She huffed, scribbled something furiously on her clipboard. Probably, "Subject exhibits blatant disrespect for floral authority," and retreated. Later that afternoon, as Sarah and her bridesmaids were doing a trial run of their walk down the aisle, a path between the oak tree and the patio, Karen was back, this time with a digital camera, its lens an intrusive, accusing eye. "Documentation, Mr. Maxwell, for the HOA records. Unregulated foot traffic on residential lawns can lead to soil compaction." Sarah, bless her, nearly tripped over her own feet in surprise. Daniel rushed to her side, shooting Karen a look that could curdle milk. I stepped forward. "Mrs. Albright, you are currently photographing private individuals on private property without their consent. That's bordering on harassment. I'd advise you to desist." My tone was flat, devoid of emotion, the kind that usually made non-compliant business owners suddenly very attentive during fire safety inspections. She lowered the camera, a flicker of something, perhaps not fear, but certainly uncertainty, in her eyes. "I am merely documenting potential bylaw infractions, as is my duty as HOA president." "Your duty," I said, stepping closer, forcing her to tilt her head back slightly to maintain eye contact, "does not extend to violating state privacy statutes. Nor does it grant you the right to disrupt a private family event. This is your final, informal warning. The next one will be formal, and it will involve entities far more significant than your homeowners association." She blanched, actually blanched, the color draining from her already pale face. She muttered something about uncooperative residents and scurried back to her beige fortress. I watched her go, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. This wasn't just about rules anymore, it was about cruelty. She was actively trying to spoil what should have been one of the happiest days of my son's life. The folding chairs, stacked innocently, became symbolic. They represented joy, communion, family. To her, they were an affront, a challenge to her paper-thin authority. And I knew, with grim certainty, that the chairs would be the pretext for her final, most egregious act. She was a creature of predictable orbits. Her escalation had a rhythm, a terrible, mundane inevitability. The only question was the precise timing of her self-immolation. I made a mental note to ensure my phone was fully charged and my badge readily accessible on the morrow. Some fires, you just know, are going to need more than a garden hose to extinguish. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and painfully beautiful, the kind of autumn day that poets write odes about and brides dream of. The air was crisp, the sky an unflawed cerulean, and the turning leaves on the old oak tree seemed to glow with an inner fire. Daniel was a bundle of nerves and excitement, fussing with his tie, rereading his vows until the paper was softened at the edges. Sarah, when she arrived with her bridesmaids, was radiant, a vision in ivory and lace, her smile capable of melting glaciers. For a few precious hours, the specter of Karen Albright receded. We were enveloped in a bubble of love, laughter, and last-minute preparations. The caterers set up discreetly, the scent of roasting herbs mingling with the faint perfume of late-season roses. The string quartet, friends of Sarah's from her university days, tuned their instruments, the melancholic sweetness of a cello drifting through the yard. Guests began to arrive, their faces beaming, their congratulations heartfelt. It was, in a word, perfect. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 p.m. At 2:55 p.m., as Daniel stood under the floral arch, his best man, my younger son Michael, beside him, and Sarah began her walk down the grassy aisle on her father's arm, the idyllic scene was shattered. Not by a sudden downpour, not by a misplaced ring, but by the distant, unmistakable wail of a siren, growing rapidly closer. A collective murmur rippled through the guests. Heads turned. Daniel's smile froze. Sarah stopped, her eyes, wide and luminous, fixing on mine with a question I couldn't immediately answer. The siren cut off abruptly, right outside our house. Then, the heavy thud of car doors. My blood ran cold. I knew, with a sickening certainty, who was responsible. Through a gap in the hedge, I saw them, Officers Miller and Diaz, looking even more uncomfortable than they had during our previous, less formal encounters. And there, on her porch, practically vibrating with vindictive glee, was Karen Albright, pointing dramatically towards our backyard, her mouth moving in what I could only imagine were dire pronouncements of our collective guilt. This was it. This was her grand gesture, her piece de resistance of petty tyranny. She hadn't just called about noise or parking. She'd summoned the police to the very threshold of my son's wedding ceremony. The sacredness of the moment, the culmination of months of planning and years of love, meant nothing to her. It was just another opportunity to assert her pathetic dominance. My son's face, moments before alight with a profound, almost holy joy, was now a mask of disbelief and dawning anger. Sarah's lower lip trembled, and a single tear traced a path through her carefully applied makeup. That tear, that one single tear, was the spark that ignited the bonfire of my carefully controlled fury. This was no longer about bylaws or permits. This was a desecration. This was an act of deliberate, malicious, emotional vandalism. Officer Miller, his expression apologetic, stepped through the side gate, which someone had thoughtfully left open. "Mr. Maxwell? Terribly sorry, sir, but we've had a call." A serious one this time. Allegations of an illegal public assembly, operating without proper city permits, potentially exceeding occupancy limits for a residential zone. Karen, emboldened by their presence, had now advanced to her own property line, her voice carrying clearly. "It's a disgrace. Look at them. An unauthorized commercial enterprise in our quiet neighborhood. They have no respect for the rules. Shut it down, officers. Shut it down." The sheer audacity, the unmitigated gall of the woman was breathtaking. My guests were silent, stunned. Daniel looked like he was about to explode. I held up a hand, a gesture for calm, though inside I was anything but. The carefully constructed dam of my professional composure was cracking. The county fire marshal was about to clock in, whether Karen Albright was ready for him or not. I took a deep, steadying breath. The scent of Sarah's bouquet, lilies and roses, suddenly sharp and poignant. The string quartet had fallen silent, their bows resting on their strings, their faces a mixture of confusion and concern. Daniel's eyes met mine, a silent plea for intervention, for restoration, for this nightmare to end. He knew my temper, usually slow to rouse but formidable when provoked. He also knew my profession, though it rarely intersected with our home life in such a dramatic fashion. "Officers," I began, my voice preternaturally calm, a thin layer of ice over a raging sea. "As I believe we've established previously, this is a private family event." I reached into my jacket. The same jacket, the same pocket. The familiar weight of the badge, the crisp folds of the permit. It felt less like a document now and more like a weapon. "Frank Maxwell, County Fire Marshal." I presented the badge first, letting the afternoon sun glint off the polished metal. Miller nodded, a weary recognition in his eyes. Diaz looked like he wished he'd called in sick. "And this," I continued, producing the permit with a slow, deliberate movement, "is Special Event Permit, 734 Alpha Charlie. It covers the chairs, the guests, the music, the entire shebang, as I believe I mentioned. signed by Mayor Thompson. I extended it towards Miller. He took it, his gaze dropping to the official letterhead, the mayoral signature clear and unequivocal. Karen, still hovering at the edge of her domain, let out a squawk. That can't be right. He can't just override HOA regulations. I am the president. I turned my head slowly, fixing her with a look that could freeze alcohol. Mrs. Albright, I said, my voice carrying with effortless authority, municipal and county ordinances, especially those pertaining to public safety and special event management, which this permit definitively addresses, generally take precedence over HOA covenants, particularly when said covenants are being, shall we say, creatively interpreted to harass law-abiding citizens. Furthermore, your interpretation of commercial enterprise is, to put it mildly, delusional. Officer Diaz coughed, a small strangled sound. Miller finished reading, his face impassive. He handed the permit back. Seems in order, Marshal Maxwell. Apologies for the interruption, folks. He looked genuinely chagrined. Our dispatcher logged it as a potential major disturbance. Understood, officer, I said. Your response was appropriate given the information you had. The information, however, was malicious and false. My gaze flicked back to Karen, who was now sputtering, her face a mottled red. Now, I continued, the ice in my voice thickening, since a 911 call has been activated from Mrs. Albright's residence, citing concerns that, while misdirected at my property, imply a certain heightened awareness of potential hazards in the immediate vicinity, I find myself professionally compelled. It is, after all, my sworn duty to ensure the safety of all residents and their lawfully assembled guests. I took a step towards the gate, then paused. Officer Miller, Officer Diaz, your presence might still be required. Standard procedure when a fire marshal initiates an on-site safety inspection following a public complaint, even one made in bad faith, especially one made in bad faith. It helps to have objective witnesses. Miller and Diaz exchanged a look. It was the look of men who knew they were caught in the gears of something far larger than a spat over folding chairs. Diaz actually looked a little grimly pleased. Miller just looked resigned. Lead the way, Marshal, he said. The shift was palpable. The power dynamic had inverted with the speed of a dropped gavel. The hunters had become not quite the hunted, but certainly the subject of intense, unwelcome scrutiny. Karen's eyes widened, a dawning horror replacing the vindictive triumph. You can't come onto my property, she stammered. Actually, Mrs. Albright, I said, my smile utterly devoid of warmth. Given that your 911 call effectively declared this area a potential zone of public interest regarding safety, and given my statutory authority as county fire marshal, I absolutely can. It's called implied consent, coupled with exigent circumstances if I deem them present. And right now, I'm deeming your rather agitated state, coupled with your previous misuse of emergency services, rather exigent, shall we? The wedding guests were utterly silent, watching this unfold with rapt attention. Daniel gave me a small, almost imperceptible nod. Sarah managed a watery smile. The show, it seemed, was not quite over. It had just moved to a different stage. I walked towards Karen Albright's pristine beige house with the measured tread of a man who knew exactly where every load-bearing wall and fire code violation was likely to be found. Even if only metaphorically for now, Officers Miller and Diaz fell in step slightly behind me, a reluctant honor guard for this impromptu inspection. Karen trailed us, sputtering protests like a faulty sprinkler head. This is an outrage, an abuse of power. I'll report you. I know people. Please do, Mrs. Albright, I said without looking back. Mayor Thompson is a personal friend. I'm sure he'd be fascinated to hear about your interpretation of civic responsibility. And my supervisor, Chief Brannigan, is always keen to learn about new and innovative ways his marshals are ensuring public safety. This seemed to momentarily silence her, or at least reduce the volume of her indignation to a low, furious grumble. We reached her porch, a sterile expanse of concrete adorned with a single, mournful-looking fern. Now, Mrs. Albright, I began, my tone all business. Let's start with the most obvious potential hazard you might have inadvertently brought to my attention: propane. I believe I smelled it earlier. Do you have a barbecue grill? Perhaps a patio heater? Or any other propane-fueled appliances? Her eyes darted nervously towards the side of her house. I have a grill. It's perfectly safe. I'm sure it is, I said soothingly. We'll just verify its placement relative to combustible materials and structures, ensure the tank is within its certification date, and check for proper ventilation. Standard stuff. Section 308.1. 4 of the International Fire Code, if you're keeping notes. I didn't actually smell propane, not strongly anyway, but her earlier agitation and the general vibe of someone who cuts corners while demanding perfection from others gave me a professional hunch. We rounded the corner of her house. There it was. A large, gleaming stainless steel grill, and next to it, not one, but two 20-pound propane tanks. One was connected, the other presumably a spare. So far, so normal. Except, Mrs. Albright? I said, pointing. That spare tank. It appears to be stored directly adjacent to the grill, within inches of the house wall, which I note is vinyl siding. Vinyl siding, as you may know, is a combustible material. She scoffed. It's always been there. It's perfectly fine. Actually, I countered, pulling a small county-issued measuring tape from another pocket. I come prepared for many eventualities. NFPA 58, which the county adopts, requires a minimum of 10 feet clearance from a source of ignition and any building opening or combustible exterior finish for spare cylinders of that size, if not stored in an approved locker. This, I measured, is approximately 8 inches. Violation. Diaz whistled softly. Miller was jotting notes. Furthermore, I continued, peering at the certification date stamped on the collar of the connected tank. This tank's requalification expired 6 months ago. Using an out-of-date cylinder is another rather significant violation. Potential for catastrophic failure, you see. Karen's face was now the color of old parchment. But no one ever told me. Ignorance of the code, Mrs. Albright, is not a defense, I said, channeling countless courtroom dramas. It is, however, a common contributing factor to preventable accidents. I made a show of looking around her meticulously tidy, yet somehow soulless, backyard. And while we're on the subject of compliance and official documentation, a new thought, deliciously ironic, began to form. Your HOA. You mentioned being president. HOAs in this county are required to register annually with the Department of Commerce and Consumer Affairs. A simple administrative task ensures transparency, proper governance. When was your last filing date, Mrs. Albright? She stared at me dumbfounded. I don't handle the paperwork directly. The secretary. But as president, I pressed gently, you are ultimately responsible for ensuring compliance, are you not? Much like I am responsible for fire safety in this county. I already had my phone out, discreetly navigating to the county database. My tech-savvy sidekick, my son Michael, had once shown me how to access all sorts of public records with surprising ease. Let's just have a quick look, shall we? Albright. Ah, here we are. The Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. Last filing 2 years ago. Registration status. Lapsed. Delinquent. The silence that followed was profound. Even the crickets seemed to hold their breath. Karen Albright, champion of rules, stickler for bylaws, enforcer of imagined infractions, had failed to comply with one of the most basic legal requirements for her own organization's existence. The irony was so thick you could spread it on toast. Well, this is problematic, I said, my voice laced with carefully measured understatement. An unregistered HOA has questionable legal standing to enforce its covenants, levy fines, or indeed, lodge official complaints about much of anything. It's almost as if it doesn't officially exist. The beautiful, intricate trap, sprung not by malice alone, but by her own arrogant negligence. The folding chairs were avenged. The evacuation order wasn't shouted, it was delivered with the calm, implacable finality of a judge passing sentence. Mrs. Albright, I stated, my voice carrying the full weight of my office. Due to the immediate hazard posed by the improperly stored and out-of-certification propane cylinder, specifically its proximity to combustible materials and potential for uncontrolled release, I am ordering the immediate, temporary evacuation of this structure until the hazard can be mitigated. This is pursuant to County Ordinance 112, subsection C, regarding imminent threats to life and property. Karen swayed slightly, her hand flying to her chest, as if to ward off a physical blow. Evacuate? You can't be serious. Where am I supposed to go? That, Mrs. Albright, is not my primary concern at this juncture, I replied, my tone devoid of sympathy. My primary concern is public safety, including yours, ironically enough. Officer Miller, please ensure Mrs. Albright vacates the premises. Officer Diaz, kindly assist in establishing a safe perimeter. I'll need to call in a hazmat-certified fire crew to safely remove and secure the delinquent cylinder. This was perhaps a slight escalation in terms of response, but entirely justifiable. A leaking or unstable propane tank in a residential area is a serious matter. That it was her propane tank, after she tried to ruin my son's wedding over folding chairs, was merely a delicious, karmic coincidence I was duty-bound to address with professional diligence. Miller, looking grim but resolute, gestured for Karen to move. Ma'am, please, let's not make this more difficult. Reluctantly, almost in a daze, Karen allowed herself to be ushered off her own porch and onto her lawn, a safe distance from the offending grill. She stood there, a solitary, bewildered figure, watching as I made the call on my radio. Dispatch. This is Marshal Maxwell. Requesting a single-engine, hazmat qualified, to 1214 Sycamore Lane for assistance with securing 2 compromised 20-pound LPG cylinders. Non-emergency response, but expedite if possible. Police on scene. The wedding guests, who had a front-row seat to this unfolding drama from across the street, were utterly transfixed. A low murmur went through them, a mixture of disbelief and, I suspect, a healthy dose of schadenfreude. My son Daniel caught my eye and gave a slow, deliberate wink. Sarah, beside him, was actually smiling now, the earlier tears forgotten. The arrival of Fire Engine 3, its lights flashing, standard procedure, not for show, I assure you, was the public apotheosis of Karen's downfall. Neighbors, drawn by the initial police presence, and now the sight of a fire truck pulling up to Karen Albright's immaculate curb, began to emerge from their houses. Mrs. Henderson from 3 doors down, Mr. Peterson from across the way. A small, curious crowd was gathering. Karen, who thrived on being the center of attention, was now precisely that, but not in the way she'd ever envisioned. She was the spectacle, the object lesson. The firefighters, professional and efficient, quickly assessed the situation, donned appropriate safety gear, and carefully removed both propane tanks. The out-of-date one tagged for disposal, the spare relocated to a compliant distance once I'd ascertained it was, at least, within its certification. The entire operation took less than 20 minutes. But for Karen Albright, I imagine it felt like an eternity of public humiliation. I issued her a formal notice of violation, detailing the code infractions and the corrective actions required, including proper certification for any future propane use. I also handed her a printout from the county website, showing her HOA's lapsed registration status. You'll want to get this rectified immediately, Mrs. Albright, I advised, my tone studiously neutral. Operating an unregistered HOA carries potential fines and, as I mentioned, significantly curtails its legal authority. She took the papers with a trembling hand, her face a mask of stunned defeat. The fight had gone out of her. The queen had been deposed, not by a rebellion, but by the quiet, unyielding power of duly constituted authority, an authority she herself had so foolishly invoked. The fire engine departed. Officers Miller and Diaz, after taking my statement and a copy of the violation notice for their report, also prepared to leave. Well, Marshal, Miller said, a hint of a smile playing on his lips. That was eventful. Just another day, ensuring the safety and well-being of our citizens, officer, I replied, my own face impassive. But inside, a small, cold flame of satisfaction burned brightly. Justice, like a good fire inspection, is best served thoroughly. With Karen Albright temporarily displaced, and her reign of suburban terror momentarily paused, a palpable sense of relief settled over our backyard. The string quartet, as if on cue, struck up a cheerful Vivaldi piece. The caterers, who had watched the entire spectacle with wide-eyed amusement, resumed their quiet ministrations. My brother-in-law discreetly topped up champagne flutes. Daniel walked over to me, his face a mixture of gratitude and awe. "Dad," he said, shaking his head, I don't even know what to say. Thank you." Sarah, linking her arm through his, beamed. "Yes, thank you, Frank. You saved the day, and our wedding." I clapped Daniel on the shoulder. "Nonsense. The day was always saved. The permit ensured that. Mrs. Albright merely provided an unexpected intermission and a valuable lesson in civic procedure." I winked. "Now, I believe you two have some vows to exchange." The ceremony resumed, perhaps 25 minutes delayed, but imbued with an atmosphere it hadn't possessed before, a kind of triumphant camaraderie. The guests, no longer just passive observers, felt like participants in a minor victory against pettiness. The air buzzed with suppressed laughter and admiring glances in my direction. When the officiant, a close family friend, finally said, "You may now kiss the bride," the cheer that went up was probably audible 3 blocks away, perhaps even reaching Karen, stewing on her lawn next to the indentation where her hazardous propane tanks used to sit. The reception that followed was joyous, unmarred by further incident. Toasts were made, dances were danced, and the cake, a magnificent 3-tiered lemon-raspberry affair, was devoured with gusto. During my father of the groom speech, I kept it brief and heartfelt, focusing on Daniel and Sarah and their future happiness. I made only one oblique reference to the earlier drama. To Daniel and Sarah, I raised my glass. May your life together be filled with love, laughter, and the wisdom to always check your permits. And may you always know the difference between a genuine hazard and agitated busybodies. A wave of knowing laughter swept the tent. From our yard, we had a clear view of Karen Albright's house. She had, at some point, retreated inside, the front door closing with a distinct thud of finality. Perhaps she was on the phone to her lawyer, or perhaps she was simply staring at the notice of violation, the words, "Immediate compliance required," burning into her retinas. Later, as the evening drew in and the fairy lights cast a magical glow, Mayor Thompson himself made an appearance. He'd been at another function, but had promised to stop by. He clapped me on the back. "Frank, heard there was a bit of excitement earlier. Something about an overzealous HOA president and a well-timed fire inspection." His eyes twinkled. News, apparently, traveled fast in our little city, especially when it involved a touch of poetic justice. "Just ensuring community standards were being upheld, Tom," I said, my voice dry. "On all fronts," he chuckled. "Good man. Always said you had a knack for comprehensive problem-solving." He then raised his glass to the happy couple, blissfully unaware of the finer details of Karen Albright's regulatory comeuppance. The party continued late into the evening, the music a joyful soundtrack to a day that had teetered on the brink of disaster but had been pulled back by a firm, authoritative hand. My wife, Martha, squeezed my arm. "You handled that beautifully, Frank, with firmness and surprising restraint." "Restraint, my dear," I murmured, watching Daniel twirl Sarah on the makeshift dance floor, "is often the most effective accelerant for justice." She smiled, understanding the layers of meaning. The victory wasn't just in the successful wedding. It was in the assertion of reason over irrationality, of legitimate authority over petty tyranny. And the fact that Karen Albright had, in essence, called the fire marshal on herself, was an ironic cherry on a cake already rich with satisfaction. The days following the wedding were filled with a quiet, satisfying hum of consequence. The official report on Karen Albright's property violations was filed with the county clerk, a public record detailing the illegal propane storage, the expired cylinder, and the mandated corrective actions. Fines were levied, not punitive, but certainly enough to sting a woman whose life revolved around the meticulous, if often misapplied, accounting of others' supposed debts to her precious HOA. The order to have any future propane tanks professionally installed and certified was unequivocal. Her days of cavalierly placing explosive materials next to her vinyl siding were over. The matter of the lapsed HOA registration, however, proved to be a more insidious poison pill. News of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association's delinquent status spread through the neighborhood like wildfire, fanned by the attendees of Daniel and Sarah's wedding, who recounted the tale with varying degrees of dramatic flair. Suddenly, Mrs. Borden, Albright's authority, already morally bankrupt in the eyes of many, was now legally questionable. How could she enforce covenants when her own organization was effectively defunct in the eyes of the county? Whispers turned into open discussions. Old grievances, long suppressed under Karen's iron-fisted, and apparently illegitimate, rule, began to surface. Mrs. Henderson, emboldened, openly challenged a warning Karen had given her about the unapproved shade of her garden gnomes. Mr. Peterson started parking his vintage, perfectly restored, but undeniably large, pickup truck in his driveway again. A direct affront to a no commercial vehicles rule Karen had tried to enforce with religious zeal. The silent majority, it turned out, had merely been waiting for a crack in the facade. My actions, born of a father's protective fury, had inadvertently become the crowbar that pried that crack wide open. I received a few anonymous thank you notes in my mailbox. One, written in shaky cursive, simply said, "Thank you for standing up to her." Some of us were too afraid. It was a sobering reminder of the quiet anxieties that can fester in a community ruled by a petty despot. The HOA itself was thrown into turmoil. A special meeting was called, or rather, an attempt was made to call one. Several residents pointed out, quite rightly, that an unregistered HOA probably couldn't hold a legally binding meeting anyway. Karen's position as president was untenable. Her credibility was shot. The carefully constructed edifice of her power, built on a foundation of misapplied rules and intimidation, crumbled when exposed to the harsh light of actual legal statutes. I heard through the grapevine, my wife's bridge club, an invaluable source of local intelligence, that Karen was considering selling her house. The neighborhood, once her personal kingdom, had become a landscape of public failure and quiet derision. She tried to weaponize community standards against my family, and in doing so, had found herself utterly undone by them. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, least of all, I suspect, on Karen herself. My role in all this was carefully managed. I made no public statements, offered no unsolicited opinions. My official report spoke for itself. My actions had been those of a county fire marshal, responding to a perceived hazard. That the hazard was located on the property of the individual who had maliciously reported a non-existent one at my son's wedding was simply a detail. A highly satisfying, deeply ironic detail. The county, of course, reviewed the incident. Chief Brannigan called me in. "Maxwell," he'd said, leaning back in his chair, a rare smile playing on his lips. "Read your report on the Sycamore Lane incident, propane tanks, and an unregistered HOA. Sounds like you had a busy Saturday." "Just following procedure, Chief," I replied, my face a mask of professional neutrality. He nodded slowly. "Good work, Frank. Thorough. Very thorough." And that was that. The system, for once, had worked exactly as it should, albeit with a little nudge from a father who also happened to be the county fire marshal. The ripples of Karen's folly continued to spread. A cautionary tale whispered at neighborhood barbecues and over garden fences, a testament to the fact that sometimes the most effective way to deal with a bully is to simply hand them enough rope, confident in the knowledge that their own arrogance will fashion the noose. Looking back, the whole debacle with Karen Albright feels less like a suburban squabble and more like a morality play, staged in our unassuming backyard with folding chairs as props and a wedding as the catalyst. It wasn't just about protecting my son's special day, though that was the fierce, undeniable impetus. It was about drawing a line against the casual tyranny of those who mistake officiousness for authority, who wield petty rules like weapons to diminish and control others. Karen was a caricature, certainly, but her type is all too common. The self-appointed guardian of conformity, blind to their own hypocrisy, deaf to the nuances of human decency. My intervention was, in essence, an act of reasserting boundaries, not just the physical boundary of my property line, which she so brazenly disregarded, but the moral boundaries that define a civil society. There's a profound difference between upholding genuine community standards and using the illusion of those standards to bully and harass. Karen had crossed that line with impunity for far too long, and my son's wedding was simply the transgression that tipped the scales. The satisfaction I felt wasn't just vengeful, it was the cleaner, colder satisfaction of seeing a system, however flawed, work to correct an imbalance. My authority as fire marshal, usually applied to buildings and businesses, became a tool for a different kind of structural correction, a correction in the social architecture of our small corner of the world. The fact that her own actions triggered the inspection, that her misplaced 911 call led directly to the unraveling of her power, was a piece of situational irony, so perfect it felt scripted. She had intended to bring the weight of officialdom down on us, and instead, it had landed squarely on her own head, exposing the rot in her own foundations, the illegal propane, the lapsed HOA registration. These weren't things I manufactured. They were pre-existing conditions, vulnerabilities she herself had cultivated through negligence and arrogance. I merely illuminated them. The wedding, in the end, was more beautiful for the interruption. It had a story, a narrative of triumph over absurdity. Daniel and Sarah's vows, when finally spoken, carried an extra layer of resonance. They weren't just committing to each other, they were celebrating the resilience of joy in the face of pettiness. It became a symbol of our family's refusal to be cowed, a quiet testament to standing firm. The locked gate of Karen's empty driveway for weeks afterwards, before the "for sale" sign finally went up, was its own kind of psychological closure for the neighborhood. The porch light on our house, shining brightly on the nights that followed, felt like a beacon of reclaimed peace. There's a somber resilience learned from such encounters. It reinforces the understanding that while one cannot always choose one's neighbors, one can choose how to respond to their encroachments. My response was tactical, precise, and ultimately effective. It wasn't about escalating a feud. It was about ending one, decisively and on terms dictated by law and reason, not by Karen Albright's delusions of grandeur. I hope, wherever she landed, she learned something about the true meaning of community, about the difference between enforcing rules and respecting rights. But even if she didn't, the lesson was not lost on Sycamore Lane. And sometimes, ensuring the safety of a community means extinguishing a small, localized source of toxicity, even if it's just one very misguided HOA president with an illegally stored propane tank and an overinflated sense of her own importance. The folding chairs were long since returned, but the memory lingers, a reminder that even in the most mundane of settings, the fight for simple dignity can sometimes require a badge, a permit, and a working knowledge of the fire code.